The biggest financial mistake people are making right now is assuming that if prices haven't exploded yet, then the danger has passed. It hasn't. In fact, the most expensive part of an economic shock usually doesn't show up immediately. It arrives later, quietly, in pieces. First it looks like fuel. Then it looks like groceries. Then it looks like travel getting weirdly expensive. Then it shows up in borrowing costs, monthly bills, and the kind of budget pressure that makes people say, "Why does everything suddenly feel harder?" That's the trap. Because by the time the average person feels the full impact, the original event is already old news. The headlines are gone. The urgency is gone. But the cost is just getting started. And that's exactly what we're breaking down today. This isn't just a story about one crisis, one market, or one scary week in the news. This is a story about how a global shock turns into 5 separate waves that hit your wallet on 5 different timelines. Some people will adjust early and barely stay ahead. Others will spend the next 6 months wondering why life keeps getting more expensive, even though nobody can point to one single reason. I'm going to show you the full chain reaction, the timing of each wave, and most importantly, what you should do before those waves fully arrive. Welcome to MatFin Lab, where we turn chaos into numbers and numbers into strategy. When markets get hit by geopolitical tension, supply disruption, or an energy shock, most people only notice the first layer. They notice the obvious thing. Usually that's gas prices. And that makes sense because gas is visible. It's on a giant sign every time you drive by. You don't need an economics degree to know when filling up suddenly feels painful. But the gas station sign is never the full story. Energy is not just something you buy directly. It's baked into transportation, manufacturing, farming, shipping, warehousing, air travel, packaging, and financing expectations. So when energy markets get stressed, the impact doesn't move in a straight line. It spreads through the economy like a delay fuse. That's why this kind of shock is so dangerous for households. It doesn't hit all at once. It hits in layers. And if you only prepare for the first layer, the later ones are the ones that wreck your budget. So instead of asking, "Will this affect me?" ask the better question. When will it affect me and in what order? That's where the 5-wave model matters. To make this real, let's follow 2 households. First, we have Elena. She's 29, works in education, earns a steady income, has a small emergency fund, contributes to index funds every month, and keeps her credit card paid off. She's not rich. She's just organized. Then we have Marcus and Tia. Dual-income household. Decent earnings. Busy lives. Some savings, but not much. A revolving credit card balance. Car payment. Vacation plans. They're not reckless. They're just operating with no margin for error. Same city. Same stores. Same economy. But the next few months won't feel the same for them. Not because one household got lucky. Because one household reacts early, and the other reacts late. That's the whole game in personal finance during a shock cycle. Not prediction perfection, just earlier adjustment. Now let's walk through the 5 waves. Wave 1 is fuel, and this is the one everyone sees first. When oil or transport routes get disrupted, fuel prices respond quickly. Not always permanently, but quickly enough to change consumer behavior almost immediately. And here's the mistake people make. They look at the extra cost at the pump and think, annoying but manageable. On its own, maybe. But fuel is rarely the real problem. Fuel is the warning shot. Because when gasoline and diesel rise, households lose flexibility fast. Commutes cost more. Delivery costs rise. Service businesses pass through surcharges. And the psychological effect is just as powerful as the math. People start spending more cautiously, but often too late and in the wrong places. For Elena, this wave means she cuts a few convenience expenses right away. Fewer random coffee stops. Fewer unnecessary drives. Nothing dramatic. For Marcus and Tia, fuel just gets added to the pile. They don't change anything yet because it still feels survivable. That's how wave 1 works. It doesn't break you. It softens you up for waves 2 through 5. Wave 2 is where people start saying, "Wait, why is my normal shopping trip suddenly so expensive?" This is where the delayed pass-through begins. Food doesn't teleport onto shelves. Household goods don't magically appear in stores. Every item you buy depends on trucks, refrigeration, packaging, inputs, and restocking systems that all become more expensive when transport and energy costs rise. And retailers usually don't pass everything through on day 1. They delay. They absorb what they can. They wait for contracts to reset. Then little by little, prices catch up. This is why the second wave feels so confusing. Because when groceries go up, most people don't connect it to an earlier energy or logistics shock. They assume they're spending carelessly. They think maybe they added more items than usual. Maybe inflation is still weird. No, this is the chain reaction. Elena notices the shift early and adapts. She plans meals more carefully, buys staples in advance, and reduces expensive convenience spending before it becomes necessary. Marcus and Tia don't realize the pattern until checkout totals start overshooting the budget every single week. That's when stress enters the room. Not because one shopping trip is catastrophic, because the new baseline is quietly moving higher. Now we get to the wave most people never see coming. This is the delayed input wave. In every major economic disruption, there's a category of costs that doesn't hit consumers immediately because it begins much further upstream. Agricultural inputs, industrial materials, replacement parts, packaging inputs, financing costs for inventory, shipping contracts. All the boring stuff nobody talks about until the consequences show up months later. This is the dangerous wave because by the time it arrives, the public has mentally moved on. The headlines are different. The original crisis feels old. But businesses are still dealing with the higher costs created weeks or months earlier, and eventually those costs land on consumers. This is when people start feeling like their money has lost weight. Same paycheck. Less buying power. Elena doesn't know exactly which categories will rise next, but she understands the pattern. So she creates margin, a little more cash, fewer impulse buys, and no new debt. Marcus and Tia keep living like the pressure is temporary. They assume things will normalize next month. Sometimes they do. But when they don't, households without margin get trapped in reaction mode. And reaction mode is expensive. Wave 4 hits the parts of life people still think of as flexible. Flights, hotels, ride shares, repairs, entertainment, delivery, and a lot of personal services. This is where the middle class really feels the squeeze. Because essentials going up is one thing. But when optional life also gets more expensive, people realize they're not just paying more to survive. They're paying more to maintain the same lifestyle. Airlines face fuel pressure. Service companies face transport pressure. Businesses with thin margins face wage pressure and energy pressure at the same time. So summer travel gets repriced. Maintenance gets repriced. Even the little conveniences people use to protect their time start costing meaningfully more. Elena sees this coming and books early where she can. She avoids waiting for, maybe prices will come down. Marcus and Tia delay decisions. Then 1 month later, every option is worse. More expensive flights, higher hotel rates, less room in the budget, and more of it going on credit. This is the point where a temporary shock becomes a lifestyle downgrade. Not always permanent, but painful enough to change behavior. Wave 5 is the most dangerous one because it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels administrative. A rate that doesn't come down. A refinancing opportunity that disappears. A credit card balance that keeps charging interest. A car loan that looks slightly worse than expected. A mortgage payment that stays stubbornly high. This wave destroys financial progress quietly. And it matters because during uncertain periods, central banks and lenders get cautious. If inflation pressure stays sticky, borrowing costs don't fall the way households hope. And if labor markets weaken at the same time, families get squeezed from both directions. High costs and fragile income confidence. That combination is brutal. Because once you carry high-interest debt into a period of elevated living costs, every month becomes harder to reverse. Elena is annoyed by higher rates, but not trapped by them. She has cash reserves. She keeps investing. She avoids panic. Marcus and Tia feel every part of Wave 5. The card balance grows slower than a crisis, but faster than they can ignore. Relief keeps getting postponed. And what should have been a short-term squeeze becomes a 6-month setback. That's why debt is so dangerous in shock cycles. It turns pressure into persistence. At this point, most people make one of two bad decisions. They either panic, or they freeze. Panic looks like selling investments, abandoning long-term plans, and making emotional money decisions because the headlines feel unbearable. Freezing looks like doing nothing, carrying debt, ignoring the budget drift, and hoping prices reverse before real damage is done. Both responses are expensive. What works better is boring, disciplined adjustment. Not drama. Not prediction addiction. Not trying to outguess every market move. Just tightening the system before the system tightens on you. That's the real lesson here. Economic shocks punish late reactions much more than imperfect ones. You do not need perfect foresight. You need faster adaptation than the average person. So what should viewers actually do? First, increase financial breathing room immediately. If your emergency fund is weak, build it. Even a modest cash buffer changes everything when prices rise unevenly. Second, attack high-interest debt aggressively. If you're paying 20% plus on revolving balances, that is not a side issue. In a pressured economy, it's financial quicksand. Third, don't sabotage your long-term investments because the short-term feels ugly. Volatility is uncomfortable, but emotional exits usually cost more than patience. Fourth, price future expenses now. If you know you'll need flights, repairs, school purchases, or major seasonal spending, look earlier than normal. Delay is often more expensive than action. Fifth, audit recurring spending. Not because lattes are the problem, but because households that survive shocks best usually know exactly where their money is leaking before the real squeeze begins. That's the difference between control and confusion. Here's what most people will say a few months from now. Everything just got more expensive. And technically, they'll be right. But what they'll miss is that it didn't happen all at once. It happened in waves. A visible wave, a delayed wave, an invisible wave, a lifestyle wave, and finally, the dead-end rates wave that quietly drains the most money of all. That's why preparation matters so much. Not because it makes you immune, but because it keeps you from being surprised. Elena and Marcus and Tia live in the same economy. But one household makes adjustments while the problem still looks small. The other waits until the problem becomes expensive enough to feel unavoidable. That's the entire gap. Not intelligence. Not income. Not luck. Timing. If you can see the waves before they fully hit, you give yourself options. And in a stressed economy, options are everything. This is Matt FinLab. If you want more breakdowns that turn complex economic signals into real-world financial strategy, subscribe, because the people who do best in volatile times usually aren't the ones who know the most. They're the ones who act just a little earlier than everyone else.